Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I'm continuing on with my Booker Longlist reviews and I am talking about Booth by Karen Joy Fowler. I will at some point be talking about mild spoilers for this book and I'll announce before that comes. But just to sort of say overall, a fair bit of this will be sort of relatively spoiler free. Just sort of talking about the book more generally. So this book, I was quite surprised in some ways to see sort of on the long list. I'd sort of seen people talking about it having come out, and obviously she'd previously been shortlisted for We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, I think that's right, which I've read and I mostly enjoyed. I thought it was decent, even though, complete side point on this. Loads of reviews I saw, sort of particularly on Goodreads and things, for We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, spoke about how like the twist really threw them and really surprised them in the book. And then I don't know if I'm a really bad reader. I don't know what the twist was, because I think there's something that I could see was a bit twisty, but I was like, did we not all see this coming? I might have completely misread the book. Anyway, that is a side point. Booth by Karen Joy Fowler is all about the sort of famous family of the Booths, of whom one of the sons, John Wilkes Booth, famously shot one of the presidents. And this book basically gives a bit of a backstory to him and to his family. And it's interesting because in the sort of author notes afterwards, she talks about how she wrestled with the idea of whether to write a story about somebody who had committed something like this, right? You know, somebody who had become so radicalized. Do we want to give him more oxygen? Do we want to talk more about who he is? And she really struggled with that for a while. And then she wrote this book and sort of found a way of sort of trying to talk about the family around him. I think sort of what she was saying was that essentially you can't talk about him and his family without really engaging with the fact that he was radicalized. You can't deny that part. You can't not talk about that bit. So in many ways, you have to go inside of his psyche to talk more generally about this book. And with that said, let's get talking about what this book is. So we spend a great deal of this book talking about his life, and particularly the family itself and the sort of lead up. It does that kind of classic historical fiction thing, which I think can often be really effective, of sort of building the image of the sort of society around them, building the full family, and then slowly trickling down until we find the person who this book is sort of mostly about, in an attempt to sort of give context and framing to who this person really was and where they came from. And I think that's really effective in this book. I think there was a lot of the family information that I found really interesting or really fun and really playful. My issue, I guess, overall is that I feel like this book was quite long for what it was. And not necessarily anything wrong with a good long read that's really enjoyable. I did, mostly really enjoy this book. And sort of find quite a lot to like about it. I think I just sort of, as it went on and we learned more and more about the families, and sort of particularly the kind of characters who then were closest to John Wilkes Booth, I didn't know how much of it I needed. It's sort of, well, this is nice and this is interesting, but actually I don't know how much this is really said about John Wilkes Booth. I almost would have preferred if we'd sort of gone straight in as him and sort of filled in some of the context later, or we'd just learnt about the family and then not really focused on any of the John Wilkes Booth stuff. But then if we're doing that, why do we care about this random family without John Wilkes Booth? It's sort of it's a tricky thing to kind of square, and I get the challenges that Fowler probably had in putting this together. However, we basically get this sort of backstory of the family. They're really involved in acting. They're really involved in sort of a few scandals, and particularly the acting is a motif that comes across quite a lot. Where one of the sort of patriarch of this family is this sort of famous actor that loads of people love, and then his son takes to the stage, and he's also this sort of troubled figure who is beloved and what have you. And we also see what the knock-on effects then are for John Wilkes Booth, for the family after John Wilkes Booth commits this assassination, because essentially nobody then wants to be anywhere near them. They're sort of seen as a tainted family. They're seen as having made this man who he was, whereas actually the rest of the family is shocked and is appalled by this murder. So it's a tricky sort of thing in terms of the family and how they all slot together. And I get that. And I thought that bit was actually really quite interesting because it's not something you always necessarily think too much about, right? You know, if you get a mass shooter or some kind of person who sort of committed some big crime, we don't often stop and necessarily think about you know, in the moment we might think about the family and what they must be going through, but we don't think about how that stays with them for generations afterwards. How, you know, particularly if you've got a very distinctive surname, what kind of knock-on effect that can have. So I thought that was really interesting. And the more I'm talking about it, the more I'm maybe convincing myself that I liked this book more than I thought I did. But I think just overall for me, what didn't necessarily work about the book was just that it felt a little bit unfocused at times, whereas I think actually it could have done some really interesting things if it had been either a tiny bit shorter in various bits or had maybe changed focus slightly. But all of that with the caveat that I understand that that's an incredibly difficult thing to write and do convincingly, because I'm sure that if that had happened, I'd have maybe been saying, well, actually, what's the point in having a family if we're only going to get a short amount of their story? Or what's the point in this other thing? So it's a, you know, it's a fool's game. Nobody ever really wins in this. So yeah, overall, an interesting book that I mostly enjoyed, but I think I struggled with, and of the long list so far, not my favourite. It sort of almost annoys me a little bit because there are some books that I would have loved to have seen on this long list that I think there's more of a case for than maybe this one. But yeah, I don't know. And with that, let's go on to some on that sort of bombshell. Let's go on to some spoilers about this book as well. So I mentioned a bit about some of the fallout for the family, and I mentioned a bit about the role of acting within this book. And in some ways, those are probably the closest to spoilers anyway. I don't think it spoils it to know that that's happened, because this is all historical fiction where we know that this murder's happened, this assassination is going to come in the book. I think what is quite interesting here is just the layers of trauma that sort of create seemingly create what's happening in this family. The idea that we learn that lots of these things have been happening, and that in many ways this family felt powerless to stop it, but also at the same time any small thing changing could have made everything different. And I will say especially the death scene itself I thought was really quite striking. I really liked how the book ended with this, because I thought it was done. We all know it's coming. We all know roughly the sort of the basic story around it pretty much. And, you know, the book teases that even just on the back cover or in the first few pages about what it's actually going to be like. But I think what I thought was really particularly effective about those final pages was how this book then captures the sort of inner mind of somebody who's really sort of divorced from reality by that point. So it's not just a case of like, oh, I don't like this president, let's take him down. It's a real case of this is tearing through him. It's both something really instinctual and something really planned. It's both sort of really full of anger, and it's also a fairly logical argument in his own head, and it does these things quite brilliantly, I thought. I just think that it took quite a long time to get there, is my thought. Again, long books are not the enemy, but that's a little bit of the difficulty I think I had with this book. But I will say, overall, I think it's a really enjoyable read. I think many people will take to this book quite well. I just don't necessarily see it personally on the shortlist. I'm up for being surprised. I've been Bod Booker talking about this book. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.